Hi everyone, I'm Sharon Stewart, and it's a pleasure to see you all and have Patrick and Janine with us today. And we'll start by just having have a conversation with Patrick about his book, Principles of Knowledge Auditing. So, hi Patrick, and thank you so much for joining us. And really, yeah, happy to be talking about your book. And the first thing I want to say is congratulations on the publication
Thank
of
you.
the book. And I think it would be a good starting point this evening to understand what is knowledge auditing and why is it beneficial. So can you talk to us about what knowledge auditing is as a starter, please?
Yeah. Well, I wrote 350 pages on that, so I'll have to be brief. To be very, very brief, knowledge auditing can be a great many things. It can be pretty much anything you want it to be. um, it has a number of different guises. Sometimes it's called knowledge auditing. Sometimes it's called knowledge management auditing. Sometimes it's just called KM assessments or evaluations. So in the broadest sense, it's some kind of evaluation or assessment of how the unit you're looking at, an organization, let's say, uses knowledge, how it manages knowledge. Now, it's usually, not always, but it's usually an activity that's conducted in order to develop some kind of knowledge management initiative or change in the organization, to change the way the organization behaves. So it's an audit in the sense of examining how the organization currently uses knowledge and how it manages it in order to make some kind of deliberate change to the way it uses and manages knowledge. Actually, we talked about these questions when we first talked about this session, and I just realized, during the introduction, that one of the questions we didn't discuss is how is knowledge auditing relevant to knowledge organization? We've kind of assumed that it is very often in the context of knowledge management, but it does also have implications for knowledge organization, in the sense that getting a sense of the knowledge landscape in the organization, which is what knowledge auditing is about, gives you, and using that to determine needs, knowledge management needs, gives a design specification for knowledge organization. It flows very easily out of that. And one of the subsidiary types of audit, there are different kinds of knowledge audit used for different purposes. One of them is a very basic one, which is inventorying your knowledge resources. So creating knowledge maps or inventories and using those to identify knowledge gaps and knowledge risks and so on. And that foundational activity of inventorying your knowledge resources is also, by the way, a sort of a landscape snapshot of your how your people currently describe the knowledge they use and how that knowledge applies to different activities in the organization. So the knowledge maps, and this is how I've experienced the value of knowledge auditing as well. Knowledge maps are an extremely good evidence base for building a knowledge organization system. And the broader knowledge auditing activity, which drives a definition of knowledge management needs and objectives and goals, also provides a design specification for what your knowledge organization system is intended to deliver. So there is quite a close connection between the two things.
Thank you. And as we're talking then, there are different types, as you said, it's not just one thing, it can be quite complex. And that's why at the beginning of this year, I started looking into knowledge auditing, because I wanted to understand that and what people mean when they say knowledge auditing, and are people talking about the same thing when they use this terminology. And I wanted to understand not just that, but what are people doing out there and how are they doing it? So I guess I was looking for a practitioner's guide. And one of the things you say right at the beginning of your book is that you started out with the intention of maybe doing a practitioner's guide, but as you started looking into this, that evolved. So it'd be really interesting to hear you talk about, your inspiration behind writing this book at this time.
Right. So I wouldn't call it inspiration. I would call it a gradual, oh my God, what have I got myself into feeling. So exactly as you said, I about 15 years ago, I signed a contract to write a practitioner's guide to knowledge auditing, and it was intended to be similar to organizing knowledge. So setting out frameworks for the conduct of knowledge audits in a similar way to the organizing knowledge book, very much aimed at the practitioner. And exactly as according to your experience, the more I did that, I went into it with a sense of false confidence, because I felt that I came out of the information management, information audit kind of tradition, expanded that into the knowledge management practice, so expanded the scope of the audit, but used pretty much the same frameworks and methodologies. And when I started digging into the background and the literature, and looking at the discussion forums, whenever knowledge audits or knowledge management assessments are being mentioned, it suddenly very quickly became obvious that people were talking about different things, that people were coming out of different traditions. And I started digging, and I discovered that there were 3, maybe 4 quite distinct traditions or disciplines that had quite different auditing approaches. So there's the communications audits, which developed in the 1950s and 1960s, which were actually quite similar to knowledge management, some aspects of knowledge management around the flow of information to decision makers in organizations, for example, or whether or not people in the organization understood the policies of the organization, or whether people understood how the work was to be conducted. And then behind that, in the sort of 70s and 80s, you have information audits coming along, and that literature and that practice blooms, and that in turn was quite heavily influenced by records management through the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. They took a lot of methodologies from records management. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, you have knowledge management coming along, and that blossomed its own auditing kind of literature. And when I looked at the references in the literature around those 4 traditions, a very small proportion of each discipline as it emerged knew about the prior one. So very few people getting started in information auditing and developing that body of theory and practice knew about communication audits. Very few people slightly more people in knowledge management knew about information audits, because there was a kind of a transition. There was an expansion of people in information management saw knowledge management as an opportunity. But a lot of the literature around knowledge audits doesn't reference information auditing, doesn't reference communications audits, and doesn't reference records audits. So there's this weird thing where you've got these different traditions all going along in parallel, using quite different techniques and methods. And some of the more interesting ones for knowledge management actually came out of the 1950s and 1960s. The sort of growth of social sciences and social research techniques. And it just seemed not only weird, but rather wasteful that, knowledge audits, which tend to be very narrow in their focus. I did a survey a few years back for the book, in fact, around what techniques people used in knowledge audits, and it's largely still interviews and surveys, and those are not the richest of techniques to get a good view of the most interesting knowledge work that goes on in the organization, which is not observable and is not really amenable to normalizing individual interviews, or different views of different people in different positions speaking for themselves and not in the context of others, and surveys where you're not really going to get very much insight around questions you haven't thought to ask. There's not very little discovery you can do there. So it just seemed that it would be useful to expose those traditions and the interesting techniques and methods. There's a very rich toolkit of techniques and methods available in that collective tradition if we could only open it up. So, there was this, oh my God, what have I got myself into? This book took 15 years to write. But at the same time, it seemed important and useful to be able to write it, to be able to expose these different practices.
Yeah, thank you. And the part that you just talked about, that history, where does it come from? Where are the roots? What are the triggers? What are people doing? That is essentially the first part of your book. And it really is so interesting because it's a perspective that I hadn't seen before. And you've done an extensive amount of research and it's really insightful. But obviously there's way more in the book. So can you talk to us a little bit more about, the content of the book, and what else it has in there and how it's laid out and why it's laid out in the way
Right.
it is. Yeah.
So the truth of the matter is that this is only about half of the book that I ended up realizing I had to write, and the publisher just turned around and said, we're not publishing that length of a book. So this is half of it, right? So so I had to make sense of and the next half is about knowledge mapping, which is a whole thing by itself, and methods of knowledge auditing. So that's what's coming along behind. So I had to kind of make sense of what the publisher said that they wanted to publish now in a book, and that's how I wrote the introduction, trying to make sense of where I'd gotten to and how it could be presented usefully. And what I realized is that the book takes two tracks. One is this historical archaeological track, right? Figuring out what are the traditions and the disciplines we've come from. How do they link? How could they be enriched? And the other one was a semantic track, which is trying to make sense of these different terminologies that we use and the metaphors we use when we talk about knowledge, and how metaphors can confuse us. And there were two sort of critical areas of ambiguity that troubled me, just trying to make sense of the literature and the practice, which was the ambiguity around what we mean by audit. Because audit can mean a very wide range of things. It can mean taking inventory of things. It can mean just taking stock and evaluating yourself in a quite unstructured, informal way. It can mean a tight sense of audit, like a compliance audit against a standard. It can be an audit of what you've got in terms of the value of what you have and how you're creating value from it. So disentangling meanings and creating frameworks to figure out what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about audits, and explaining to people what it is that we're talking, especially our stakeholders and sponsors. When we're doing an audit, let's explain what kind of audit we're proposing, and that clarifies the objectives, it clarifies the goals, it clarifies the trustworthiness of the findings. Because if it's a very loose self-examination audit, that has less weight, let's say, than a very scientific, well-measured, tight audit against strict standards that can be measured in a fairly credible way. And the other area of ambiguity is around knowledge. The knowledge is this, when we look at it, well, what's the saying? If you ask 5 knowledge managers for a definition of knowledge, you'll get 10 definitions. So I spend quite a lot of time in the book trying to disentangle when we talk about knowledge in the organization, what's the best way to describe it so that we can audit it, so that we can create inventories, so that people can describe the knowledge that they're using in consistent ways without having to be professional knowledge managers or philosophers or epistemologists. So naturalistic ways of describing the types of knowledge. And I spent some time comparing those different typologies and how useful they are. And I also spent some time kind of attacking sort of over liberal use of, you know, sexy metaphors. So I spend some time looting and pillaging around the use of the term knowledge assets, because I think asset is a rather challenging metaphor to use. It's a very sexy one from a management point of view, because it tries to convince people that knowledge is important. It's an asset, so it's important, so you should manage it. But at the same time, it sets up these very strange tensions around who owns knowledge in the organization. And if your most important knowledge is in the people and the capabilities that they bring to the organization, it's rather a difficult mental frame to introduce, because it makes things very transactional. Just bringing the word asset into play. So this part of the book is trying to figure out principles for how to describe knowledge productively in the organization. So that it can be described consistently by people. They can talk about the knowledge they use in consistent and well-defined ways, so that you can figure out together useful improvements. And B, how to be cautious about some of the more risky metaphors to use for describing knowledge.
Again, as I was reading that and the descriptions and all the things you just talked about, I mean, I really did find it a useful resource for helping me to think about what is it you're auditing, but in turn that informs what type of audit you would be doing.
Right.
Because it's dependent. It will make a difference as to what you're auditing, as to how you would approach that and what methods you might use.
Right.
So really, really useful. And I'm just thinking, for people on this call, what would you say the first steps people can take are to get started, and what might that look like in terms of resources, etc.?
Well, I think the most important, I wouldn't start a knowledge audit unless you feel that you've got a knowledge-related challenge where it's not clear how the knowledge in the organization, or how the knowledge management practices in the organization relate to that challenge. So you want to understand more about how knowledge is used and managed in the organization in order to improve it. And that usually starts with a challenge or an opportunity that's quite well defined. And it could be something like, I want to know how well we're doing compared to others in my industry. Or it could be something like, look, we're going into a merger or an acquisition or a joint venture of some kind. I want to compare. I want to look at how the capabilities of this organization map against the capabilities of my organization. So I want to take a knowledge view and then compare and then figure out, is this a good match? Are there things that we can balance each other out with? Or it could be something like, I've got a whole bunch of senior engineers heading towards retirement. And I realize I haven't got processes in place so I need to figure out, how do I manage this? How do I map the scale of this problem? And where do I prioritize my efforts? Each of those is quite a different scenario and purpose. So it's about having a focus, knowing what your problem statement is, even if it's not terribly well defined. Then understanding what phenomena, as you hinted just now, are you interested in? Is it the knowledge resources themselves? Usually you need to do some knowledge mapping, but you probably also want to look at your knowledge management processes, whether or not they exist, how they're working. You might want to look at your knowledge management enablers, what kind of governance you've got in place, what kind of culture around the use of knowledge. So you kind of build up this picture of, what do I need to know about? And that's the phenomena that you want to audit, and then out of that, the types of audit will fall. Usually, most knowledge audits, not all of them, but most knowledge audits will have some kind of inventorying activity, a knowledge mapping activity, an inventory audit. If it's a self-directed, that the organization itself is looking at itself. You've got a KM team in the organization. They're leading this. It's self-directed. You'll do a little bit of mapping. You'll figure out some issues. You'll explore the processes associated. So it evolves. It's a kind of evolving process. That's what I call a discovery review audit. So you're discovering things as you go along. Or it might be, we've been doing knowledge management for 10 years. There's this ISO 30401 standard here. I want to convince my management that we're, at international standards level. And so I'm going to do an audit really for political reasons. So the key thing is to have a clear sense of purpose for the audit. And out of that, you figure out the focus areas. What do I need to learn about? The phenomena. Out of that comes the methodology that you want to approach. I would never, ever, however, start an audit, A, without a purpose, but B, without having some sense or provision for follow-up action. So it's really important, I think, never do an audit without provision for follow-up, because that audit report sitting on a shelf is no use to anybody if you haven't got, everybody's exhausted at the end of the audit and there's no energy or resource left to follow through with something. And the other, I think, useful outputs from a knowledge audit are, apart from the report and the action plan, an audit usually does some kind of measurement, and that can create the basis for a dashboard for ongoing monitoring. So you go back and you look at some of these measures over time. You see how well you're doing against your action plan. And if you are doing knowledge mapping, your knowledge maps are a continuing reference resource for the organization. You can go back to them for different things. You can go back to them for, checking on your the way that your competencies and skills are being provisioned. You can go back to them to look for how your expertise and experience is being managed, or you can go back to them for how your content, your documents are being managed. So you can get different kinds of outputs from it with different sort of lengths of value over time.
Thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today and share my experience of what was quite a memorable time doing knowledge auditing during the pandemic. So just a little bit about me. As Eugene mentioned, I'm an independent knowledge management consultant. I've spent around 20 years on the front line of automotive and oil and gas companies, occupying myself with knowledge management activities. So I have that frontline experience. And I have to say, I wish I had have known about knowledge auditing a lot sooner when I was developing knowledge management strategies, etc., because I think it is a very useful, important step to take right at the very start of these journeys, because it gives you so much insight as to where to position your effort, what to work on, things like that. So yeah, I do hold knowledge auditing close to heart. So I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some slides that I can show you. Great. So yeah, I'm just going to give an outline of my case study experience here. So I worked with two companies during the pandemic. One was the British Psychological Society, so it was very different from my experience in oil and gas. And the second one was an oil and gas manufacturer towards the end of the pandemic. Now, both organisations sort of roped me into helping them with their knowledge management planning. They wanted to build the insight as to where to target their efforts, where the gaps may be, building a knowledge management strategy from scratch. They wanted to understand that landscape. And as I said, it was at the pandemic, so it wasn't quite usual circumstances. So looking at all of the information that was out there, there wasn't that much on how to do this purely in a virtual environment. Now, bearing in mind, we had just been wondering, have we got enough toilet roll in the house versus actually, if we go outside, we might end up harming our loved ones if we give them a hug. So the whole time was very, very stressful, and work and organizations just weren't operating as per usual. So it's like the whole world of work had changed. You know, we had a lot of new systems, we had a lot of new processes. People were kind of dropping out of work here and there. So as I went into this process, I thought, well, these are slightly unusual circumstances. And with knowledge auditing, it is very, you know, you need people to be there. You need people to be able to participate willingly and with, you know, open heart and mind, and because you want to get that insight, whereas times were very stressful. So wondering how to actually deliver this was a big issue. What with sort of not having the ordinary tools that I would have used, because my experience has been very much in a workshop environment, which was great because you could talk, get that experience from people, build that rapport. But online, it was slightly different. So my biggest challenge, I suppose, was how do I actually do this online? And I put there challenge Annika, because I don't know if any of you remember the show from the 80s, early 90s, where Annika Rice would be set with a very big challenge and, you know, not a lot of time to do it. You know, quite, you know, let's build a playground for some kids on top of a mountain with only shovels and pickaxes. It was not a very accommodating time. So there was a lot to do in terms of scoping the audit, getting sort of the clients on board, understanding what they needed, all from a virtual point of view. So it was quite a DIY approach, in the sense of I needed to create the whole method and process and toolkit in order for me to deliver this. So I went down a rabbit hole, if you like, of investigating lots of different tools and technologies to help me. You know, I'm a bit loath to always use Excel or, you know, post-it notes and things, just because it's a lot of effort after the fact, on sort of when you're one person, to bring that together. So picking tools that would help me get the information, support a process, support the processing of results after that, was quite it was a challenge. So I think the overall theme of the challenge I faced was actually making it happen. So understanding the scope. So as Patrick alluded to in his talk just before, you know, understanding the direction, the challenge, the exact nature of why you're actually doing this audit is fundamental to making things happen. And aligning that not only with, I suppose, the needs of the organization, but making sure that it really helps the business strategy, that you're doing it for this reason. And as I said, execution was a big deal, because I was asked, in the position of, let's do an audit, but it's not really going to be possible to speak to people because everybody has Zoom fatigue. We're all busy doing other projects, and we also have huge projects going on in an organization, and people still have to do their day jobs. So in a situation where you really need people's insight, and I make that point because yes, there's information audits, there are other audits that, assessments that I could go myself in my own time and make some assumptions, but that isn't really going to give, I think, a good sort of outcome to a knowledge audit, because you really need that deep insight from the people, because you're auditing the knowledge, not just the information resources.
Janine, can I just make a comment there to amplify what you're saying? So it just seems to me that what you're describing there is that it's not just about understanding the knowledge and how it's being, but it's the context in which the knowledge is being used, and that's something that is not completely provided in information audit. In information audit, you're looking at one slice of the knowledge work in the organization, and then in the knowledge audit, you're getting this very rich sense of context, and it's really hard to do that without participatory techniques. And what I find fascinating about your two cases is the way in which you manage to, bring in participation in very straitened circumstances. Is that
Yeah.
fair?
Oh, it's totally fair. And,
Yeah.
I think also my standpoint from knowledge management and the audits is, it is all based on context. And I think the pandemic showed that everything that we knew before the pandemic, it isn't directly applicable to in the pandemic and after. What we know and how we apply it is very much based on the context and situation that we're in. So it isn't like knowledge isn't static, and also to understand why somebody does something in a certain way or whatever, actually the context is really vital to that, especially when you're making decisions that are based on kind of your findings from the audit. So yes, I think participation is a key topic, because it's the people who can provide that. But I think also with the knowledge auditing process, I've mentioned this a few times, where it's like a positive Trojan horse. It can lead to other things. It can bring buy-in. It can bolster your communications, because people have to be involved in it and understand it. They then have more skin in the game, for then when you want to actually go and make changes, they've actually had an input into that. And like you say, it was difficult to get people involved. And on the first project, because it was online, I just said, well, let's just invite everybody. And sort of be careful what you wish for, because I think you need people in there who are going to give, I suppose, what you call, Patrick, qualified respondents, people who know the stuff, who can speak to the activities of the organization. But in my case, I identified the stakeholders. They were invited, and I kind of prompted those and made sure we got their responses. But because I was using this online platform where people could have access, I opened it up to basically everybody who wanted to be involved, which actually got some really good insight and buy-in that contributed to a lot of what we got in that discovery audit. So the first project was very much a discovery process. Let's lift the lid on the organization and see what's going on. Bearing in mind, this was the organization's very first step into knowledge management and forming their strategy. So I knew we weren't going to get sort of right into the weeds of things. It was more of a let's find out the landscape, and then we can go to deeper levels. So yeah, and I think the big learning is that it needs to provide value. And this kept me up at night and caused me to have a few bottles of wine over the process of these audits, because I was sort of, this was the first gig, if you like, as an independent practitioner who set up a business in the pandemic and had to do everything virtually. So I needed to make sure that it was going to give value if I was going to, last beyond that gig. And I say that because I remember being on the front line in projects, and when you're in a company, and the same thing applies, you're delivering this service, you need to give the value, you need it to make sense and have that context in the organization.
Which is challenging in an audit, because you often don't know what value until the end, right? It's not like you have a definite target to meet. So you're kind of discovering it as you go. And I think that participatory approach, bringing people along with you, they're building their own self-representation of how they use knowledge. That is the thing, that's your insurance policy, because they're going to guide you to the things that really matter to them. And I think that's also, and you've alluded to this a number of times when you've talked about your case studies. We find it all the time when we do knowledge audit, especially knowledge mapping workshops with clients, is you'll often have people coming in very skeptically at the beginning. This is face-to-face workshop, so you can see the skepticism on their faces.
You can feel it in the atmosphere.
Well, what is this sort of very, fuzzy-wuzzy thing, knowledge management thing? And then you get people leaving at the end of the day saying, "Oh, now I know what knowledge management is," because they've been helped to see in very concrete terms how knowledge works into the work that they do.
Exactly. I think the more that you can do in these audits, and I think I might put some of my tips up here. I think one of them is about facilitation. So I think, obviously, I'm speaking about my experience from implementing and conducting this audit. The facilitation is really vital, because I think your goal is to get the best out of those participants. I think when you have that experience, that lens, I need to get the best from these people because they need to get the benefit from it. It's an educational journey for them, and I need them to be in a space to give us the insight that we need to then go and make some business decisions. So yeah, when the light bulbs go off, that's when you've got it, and I think that ties in with the levels of value that you can provide. And I think making sure that you time the audit at the right time, the continuity. So I loved what you said before about you go into this, yes, you don't know what's going to happen and what you're going to discover, but you do know that once you've reached the end, there has to be something else. So like I say, it's not just ornaments and tumbleweeds. So I find that when you do knowledge mapping, you're not just going in an exercise, oh, we've got 5 of this, 3 of that, 2 of that. It's not about that, which I think when we're in the practitioner mind with our our geek head on, we can run through, because we love doing that, don't we? We love finding that out. But again, is it going to help the organization? And then the tumbleweeds after it. So, my second project, that I had a bit of a tumbleweed effect, because the sessions were great, but because it was in isolation and, we didn't then sort of follow it up, it was kind of like, there you go, there's the answers, there's the insight, go off and do your action planning. So I think there's a feeling at the end of the audit, wow, we've got all this insight, and it needs some more facilitation to help, actually turn that into real action. Yeah, and I think that it's got a transformational sort of quality to it, where whether it's just because people get the insight and they can do more with it, or even if it is just they change a behavior, or they do something a little bit different, the audit can bring that out, those actions, out those low-hanging fruit, if you like. So yeah, some of the tips that I've got is, understanding your business goals and the constraints that you're working in. So I had to really understand that to design my tools and my process, and working out who's in the room. So I think, like you've made a great point, Patrick, about there's so many different ways to do audits and different types and methods and all this. So I think as a practitioner, to understand the tools at your disposal, then look at the people who you need to work with and where they're at. And then you kind of marry those up to determine your approach to this audit, obviously based on what the company actually wants as well. And that should guide you in, oh hell, what practice do I pick now? When you've got all these options. And I think communication is important. So talking their language. So leave the KM geek head like at the door and then talk in their language, because you want to build that rapport. You want to get that so that it gives you the insight you need to know what direction you're going in and turn those insights into actions. So yes, there's I do have quite a long case summary document if anybody's interested in all of the very nitty-gritty details on that. I hope that's given a bit of an overview of my case study. I do have some slides if anyone wants to see any of the tools, but I'm just conscious of the time that it's 20 past if anyone's got any questions.